things like that. I generally work with a generally healthy population. I'm in the Department of Medicine and the School of Medicine at Stanford, but instead of working with the patients, as many of the physicians there do, my group is very community oriented. So we recruit from the general community, we try to get people to eat better and improve their health. And I'm really happy to be part of the ZOE group and hang out with some amazing folks like Sarah and Kirsten. So happy to participate today.
Hi everyone, so I'm Kirsten. I am an associate registered nutritionist and I've been working at ZOE for the past almost 3 years. I've been working on the Predict 1 and Predict 2 studies, which we'll talk a bit about in the presentation. And yeah, I guess these are two really big nutrition studies that have aimed to better understand personalized nutrition, but I won't give too much away before we get started.
Cool. So I can see some questions are coming through. We're going to leave questions to the end because we've got lots of ground to cover and lots of really exciting insights that that Christopher and Kirsten are going to go through. But just a quick overview of the presentation. So we're going to talk about the state of sort of nutrition advice in the United States, why things are so confusing, and go through a bit of history around that. We're going to talk about carbs. We're going to talk about how low carb diets have come about and how they've sort of been fueled by the media. And then we're going to go through some of the 4 biggest myths that we see with carbohydrates and why they exist. And then talk about what we should actually be eating, right? So that's what we all came here to learn about today, is what should we actually have for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, which is the eternal nutrition question that, I'm sure we all want the answer to. So I'll hand over to you guys to start talking about why consumers are confused by nutrition.
Yeah, so I thought we'd start off. Basically, consumers are confused. I know, before I started studying nutrition, I was very confused about the best way to eat. There's national guidelines, there's Instagram influencers, everyone's a nutrition expert because we all eat. And yeah, there was an International Food Information Council Foundation survey that was done in 2018 that basically found that 80% of the people that were surveyed find information about food and nutrition really confusing. 59% of those individuals mentioned that conflicting information makes them doubt their choices. And I guess for anyone watching, it would be great to know if this is something you've experienced. Christopher, I don't know, in your years of studying nutrition, of being a nutrition scientist, how have you seen, opinions on the best way to eat change over time?
Well, I actually would say 2 ways. One, I don't think they've changed. If you look at the US dietary guidelines, they're pretty boring. They only change really incrementally. What changes is the headlines. Some new study will come out and we've got social media and clickbait. And so it certainly doesn't sell any newspapers to just say, you know what, you should eat more vegetables and fruits. Nobody's going to read that. So really what they want to hear is everything you knew for the last 50 years is wrong. There's a brand new study out that turns everything on its head. You should be eating donuts or you should be eating steak. And that seems to drive a lot of confusion that I don't think is real. And hopefully we can get into that, Kirsten, and settle some of that.
Yeah, I think that would be great. So yeah, there's lots of different answers out there and with seemingly little agreement. And this is, so I think Christopher's going to talk a bit about this, this research that we did at ZOE, where we interviewed a panel of nutrition scientists, of experts in the field of nutrition. And what we saw was, despite the fact that there should be perfect agreement between these experts, there really wasn't. So Christopher, I'd love to hear about your experience being part of this and kind of what you, what was really interesting about these findings.
Yeah, and by the way, I think I'm row 3 and I'm all correct. So everybody else is wrong on this thing. No, Kristen, this was really fun. This was Tim Spector and I think Jonathan Wolf's idea, and we found 12 experts who disagree. We knew ahead of time would disagree to some extent, and they ranked 100 foods sort of along the lines of how good versus how bad they were. And then we did some statistics on it. And so it's a really fun heat map to show Like above, as Kristen said, if there was perfect agreement, the reds and greens would all be in alignment, but we weren't. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of alignment at the ends, to be perfectly honest. But in the middle, sort of what's okay, what's not too bad or too good for you, so you can go ahead and have it sometimes, we really disagreed a lot on what those were. And I think the challenge of doing this, Kirsten, is these weren't ever presented in terms of what to have instead. And so one of my things in nutrition that I always like to get to is, what would you have instead of this? I think we actually get more agreement if we did that. But this heat map is a really fun display of even top experts in the field. There's so many different things to eat and so many different ways to have them. I actually think it makes sense that we don't have complete agreement, but very fun exercise to show this is part of the reason for some of the confusion.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because a lot of the foods that ended up in the middle are really the ones that, they end up being the headlines when new studies come out. So whether cheese or yogurt or dairy is good for you, or artificial sweeteners. And yeah, I guess that's where all the confusion does lie. So one of the reasons for this is because really we are complicated and food is complicated too. And I think we'll touch on this a bit later on in the presentation. But if we move on to the next slide, I guess this touches a bit on what you were talking about earlier, Christopher. At least in the US and in many other countries around the world, low fat has really been the mainstay of public health messaging for years. And now it seems like there's been a change of opinion. So you've already mentioned, you don't think there's necessarily been a change in opinion, but kind of, I guess these Time magazine examples, what was it like, obviously being in the field of nutrition when these different magazines came out? What was it like having to explain to people, why maybe things didn't actually change, but, new studies are making new claims?
Yeah, really discouraging. I'd be writing a grant or writing a paper, and all of a sudden everybody would be writing to me saying, is it true? Is everything we knew wrong before and now it's all changed? And quite typically, a new study had come out with a different perspective, analyzing the same data, often not even different data, analyzing the same data and just taking a different interpretation to it, which is true in all of nutrition because, Kirsten, the problem here is we have two basic kinds of nutrition that catch a lot of headlines. One is randomized controlled trials, where you randomly assign people and you know what's cause and effect. And one is observational epidemiology, where you've been looking at hundreds of thousands of people over decades. And there's lots of these, and they keep publishing paper after paper after paper because these data are always there and they're always being shared, and it's massive data sets. But it's association, it's not cause and effect. And the challenge here is in nutrition, we would love to have randomized controlled trials for everything, but a lot of times you can't. You can't randomly assign people to do some things and not some other things. You can't assign them to be vegan for the rest of their life. You can't randomly assign them to be ketogenic or paleo. You can't randomly assign them to fast for the rest of their life or intermittently fast for the rest of their life. And so we look at some of these other studies where they were tracking people, and there's often confounders, and different people looking at the same data can actually come up with a fairly valid different interpretation, and then those get blown out of proportion. And so, Kristen, my job is often saying, okay, here's the limited randomized trials that we have and what they say, and here's the observational data, and here's the challenges we have with different interpretation. And I think we should say this today. And then there's a new study that adds a little bit to that, but it never adds a lot. It only adds a little bit, and it gets blown out of proportion when the media takes it and makes a smiley face and a frowny face with eggs, which seems like a lot of fun, but boy, it takes up a lot of my time trying to describe what that means to people.
Yeah, I think, nutrition research really is complicated, and, it's not very black and white either. It's not one or the other. I think there's quite a lot of nuance to take on board as well. So we're going to talk a bit about the rise of low carb diets, and, just a few examples of these diets are, the Atkins diet, the keto diet, low carb, paleo, and carnivore diets. Now, we intentionally included rise in quotation marks because I wanted to find out from Christopher, I guess, you know, these diets have actually been around for a very long time. It seems like they've gained popularity recently, particularly things like the keto diet. But, you know, have low carb diets really been kind of increasing in popularity? Have, you know, what has that been like being in the world of nutrition science?
Well, it seems like they've come up before, the Banting diet and the Atkins diet from a long time ago, and then they didn't work, and people forgot about them eventually. And then there was the new Atkins diet book, and it had been so long that people forgot about the studies that showed that they didn't work. And so it wasn't really new. It seems to keep cycling through, and it's really the backdrop of all this has been the food environment changing and habits changing and food being available 24/7. And so it's frustrating is it's not so much about the low carb diet. For me, it's about all the added sugar and ultra processed food and refined grain that's just become more and more and more common. And we had some old messages that we tried to simplify, and we inappropriately simplified them as low fat. I totally buy into that we oversimplified that. That was really never the whole message if you looked at the whole architecture of it. But the whole architecture of it was confusing. So people boiled it down, and now they've boiled it down to low carb. And that's equally misleading because there's lots of healthy carbs that we're going to get into. Uh-oh, did we lose Kirsten? Ah,
Sorry,
there
my
she's back.
internet's being terrible. If it cuts out, Sarah, please,
Yes,
please
sure.
can you take over. So yeah, so what are carbohydrates for those who aren't nutritional, I guess, into nutrition? For those who aren't, who don't know, carbohydrates are one of the 3 macronutrients that are found in our food. And I just guess something to caveat this with is, you know, often, you know, we can start to view food as carbohydrates, fats, and protein, but actually the food we eat is made up of thousands of different chemicals. So we've got these macronutrients, we've got micronutrients, we've got things like polyphenols, but carbohydrates specifically, they provide our bodies with energy, with the exception of fiber. So fiber, it's indigestible by us, but the microbes in our gut love it. We also have sugars, which are things like glucose, fructose, and sucrose. And then we have carbohydrates known as starch. So these are longer chains of glucose molecules that you'll find in things like potatoes, sweet potatoes, breads, etc. So if we move on to the next slide. I think this one's for Christopher. So, you know, Christopher, what are carbs in terms of the food we eat?
Yeah, and so we try to keep boiling it down to things that are simple. And here's an example of the US food pyramid from 1992 got turned into my pyramid, which then got turned into my plate. I can't remember when, maybe about 2011, I think. And so this is about as dumbed down as you can get, having 5 food groups here. And there isn't even any food here. So I thought it'd be more fun to think about not what are carbs as much as where are the carbs. Like if you're really trying to be a low carb person, what would you have to cut out? And so this is a picture that I like of my pyramid or my plate, and it's got some foods. And so I'd love everybody listening in and looking in to just look at that and think, you know, of all the different food groups we have, where are the carbs? How about, Sarah, one more slide, the grains. Are they in are the vegetables? Are they? Yep. Veggies are mostly carbs. Okay, but we want people to eat veggies. Veggies are full of fiber and they're full of nutrients. I mean, even the ketogenic group wants you to eat veggies. So don't leave out the veggies. Make sure you eat those. How about fruits? Next slide. Yeah, fruits, that's mostly carbs. Okay. And then we got that dairy group. Any carbs? Oh yeah, right, lactose, lots of carbs in the dairy. Okay, and the grains. Yep, grains are mostly carbs. And then in that protein group, other than the meat, beans and peas are in that group. So the whole damn thing is foods full of carbs. If you're going to eat low carb, what the heck are you going to eat? If you start cutting them all out, they're everywhere except meat, which would be a pretty boring diet. Meat and refined fats. And so just to appreciate, you know, I don't like talking about nutrients as much as foods. all the food groups right there are major sources of carbs. So if you're going to cut back on carbs severely and restrict them, you're not going to have a lot left to eat. So I'm always scratching my head about how low in carbs people are thinking about. So let's move on.
I think another thing to think about there is, sustainability. So like, how sustainable is a way of eating when you're very limited for your food choices? So the first carbohydrate myth we're going to be kind of busting here is one that's often quoted by proponents of like the keto diet, that carbs are really not an essential nutrient. So the truth is, carbs are technically not essential nutrients because our bodies can synthesize glucose via a pathway known as gluconeogenesis. But many carb-containing foods are actually really healthy for us. So, Christopher, what do you think about this myth, and how would you go about busting it?
Yeah, and it really does depend on what you're eating instead and what comes with the carbs. So you're right, there are a few isolated examples of populations that live for extended periods of time in the tundra of the Arctic, where there's no veggies and there's no plant things growing. And so, yep, they had seals and polar bear, and they ate a lot of meat and fish. And they actually did okay. They got an incredible amount of physical activity hunting down these things. And they were eating a seasonal diet. And so that might be possible. I can't imagine how much fun that is. I mean, there's not a whole lot of variety in that kind of diet. So technically you could do that. But we do have numbers like the acceptable macronutrient distribution range is 45 to 65% carb. There's another number that says the minimum your brain and central nervous system need is 130 grams of carb a day. Times 4 calories, that's about 500 calories a day. If a 2,000 calorie diet is what you're doing, that's a quarter of your calories. So we've got this bizarre thing about 45 to 65 is the general recommendation, 25% as the minimum for brain and central nervous system, and possibly 0 if there's no veggies or carbohydrate sources around. So you can make an argument that there isn't any clear number that Americans require, but that is not really thinking in terms of how much fiber is there for the microbiome, how about the micronutrients. And so it is a complex question. I technically carbs are not essential, but that seems ridiculous. The foods that are good sources of carbs are essential to a healthy diet.
Yes, exactly. So there's so many carb-containing foods that are healthy and nutritious. And as you rightfully said, we really need to think about, if you do want to cut carbs out of your diet, what are you actually eating in place of those? What are you replacing them with? Because that has an enormous impact on your health. So if we carry on to myth number 2, I think this is a great one. So all carbs are the same regardless of their source. And I included this myth specifically because of an article that I read recently that was comparing a banana to 7 tablespoons of sugar and basically saying they're exactly the same thing. So Christopher, what do you think about this?
Yeah, and that's when we get into the reductionism again. So are we really eating nutrients? Are we eating foods? And so picture that the foods provide pleasure and culture and taste and fun and enjoyment. And they have standard vitamins and minerals and fiber and things like that in them, as well as proteins, carbs, and fats. But beyond that, Kirsten, one of the things that nutrition really has never resolved is in most of the things we eat, there's thousands of potential phytochemicals in these carb-rich sources, which are always plant-rich foods. A lot of them are popular. There's sort of the phytoestrogens in soy and the anthocyanins in blueberries and all the cool cancer-fighting things in broccoli that we don't actually know enough about to come up with a recommendation as a vitamin or a mineral. So even just focusing on proteins, carbs, fats, vitamins, and minerals doesn't capture all the things that we're getting in our food that we've really never quite figured out how to quantify for an optimal diet. The vitamins and minerals got figured out to prevent acute deficiencies. We don't have many acute deficiencies anymore. What we're now trying to do is optimize health for vibrancy and vitality and a long life. And those are the really hard things to study because they're long-term things. So we don't really know how many anthocyanins we need. We don't know how many of the cancer-fighting agents in broccoli we need, because cancer is way harder to study than anemia or scurvy or something like that. And so, yeah, carbs are not, the foods with carbs are not all the same, because they all come with different sets of new chemicals and molecules that are probably related to good health that we still don't know enough about because they're so complicated.
Yeah, and I guess all of these different chemicals found in food, often in the process of, in food processing and refining of many carbohydrate-based ingredients, these are no longer present. So, Christopher, would you like to speak about this data from the NHANES?
Yeah, I really like this slide. So this is a paper from just last year, and they show these statistically significant trends of change, which I think cracks me up. They have so many people, these tiny little changes are statistically significant. If you look since the year 2000, total carbs are about 50% or more of our diet all the time. Fats are about 33, 34 all the time. Protein, right about 16, 17. Come on, it really doesn't change, even though that trend is statistically significant. So people are eating a little less carb and a little more fat, but this misses the point. Sarah, if you can go to the next slide, we're really much more sophisticated than that. We have low quality carbs and higher quality carbs. We've got animal and plant protein and 3 different subsets of fat types. And to me, the thing that totally stands out and what I think is this brilliant slide is that almost all these different components take up about 10% of our calories. And the one outlier is low quality carbs. Look at that. Of all the carbs, which are the biggest source of nutrients in our diet, of calories, it's more than 40% of our calories. Basically, this sums down to added sugars and refined grains. So if you want to eat a low carb diet, I'm totally in favor of getting rid as much as possible or all of the low quality carbs. If you did that, you'd have to replace them with something. And so what would you do? Could you just replace them with high quality carbs? Maybe. But could you replace them with more fat? Could you replace them with more nuts and seeds and avocados and fatty fish? Yep. So my whole take on this is yes, everybody should eat a lower carb diet because so much is low quality carb. But then what should you replace it with is the fun thing we should be talking about today.
Yeah, exactly. So myth number 3, and I guess this is why we're so excited to have you on this webinar today, Christopher. Low carb diets are better for weight loss. So Christopher was the lead researcher of a study called the Diet Fit study that basically found that when it comes to low carb versus low fat, there is no clear winner. So Christopher, would you like to talk a bit about this study and really what you set out to do and what you ended up discovering?
Yep. So Kirsten, this built off a slide that a study called the A to Z study, where back in 2007, we compared Atkins to Zone to Ornish to a health professional's diet. And we really didn't get a clear winner there. The Atkins group lost a little more than the others, but technically it wasn't only statistically significantly different than Zone, which was the other low carb diet. The more fascinating thing to me was how much variability there was in each group. There was this enormous amount of variability. And just as that study came out, I saw a couple really interesting studies about insulin resistance. And they suggested that people who are insulin resistant specifically did better on low carb. And that made a ton of sense. If they're insulin resistant and they're having a hard time with carbs, going on a low fat diet that's high in carb would be higher. And so, yes, I want to test that question. So we followed up with Diet Fits, which only had 2 diets, low carb and low fat. And I wasn't actually trying to compare them in general. I was very much trying to pick out the people who were the most insulin resistant. And I was almost sure that they would do better on a lower carb diet. But when we did this, I had to hire 5 health educators who were going to instruct these 600 plus people to do this. And I wanted them to feel good about what they were doing. I didn't want them to randomize people to a bad diet and compare it like that. So all the health educators got told that you have to teach both low fat and low carb. And you have to teach the best low carb and the best low fat that you can. And so I actually don't want any low fatters to have added sugar or refined grain, because those are low fat, but they're not healthy low fat. And I don't want the low carbers just eating lard and butter. I want them having avocados and fatty fish. So when we're done with the paper, I want you to be able to say to all the people reading it, we gave them the best low carb possible and the best low fat possible, and you'll feel good about yourself. So if we can go to the next slide, which I think is our waterfall plot.
And were they making their own meals, or were you guys like doing meal prep with them, or?
Yeah, so they got 22 evening classes. And so this was all on their own. This is free living people, so it's less rigorous, but it's more generalizable, Sarah. And so they had to do this for a year. And after a year, I made what are called waterfall plots out of the weight loss. And so it might be hard to see in this slide, but what you're seeing is every individual in the study, men and women, pictured as one tiny little bar and organized in the order of who lost the most weight versus who lost less. And in fact, some people, if you can tell, gained weight on a weight loss study. Bless their hearts for coming in at 12 months admitting that they gained weight. But these patterns are just stunningly identical. You could put one on top of the other and they would look the same. And so that wasn't actually the main part of the study. This is actually what we had hoped we would get, is this massive amount of variability, because then we would make all the headlines by showing and predicting who did better on one versus the other. And I thought maybe there was a genetic thing that didn't work, but I thought it would work, but it didn't. I really thought there was going to be an insulin resistance difference. And we did these fancy oral glucose tolerance tests, and we characterized people along the spectrum of insulin resistance, and we plugged it in, and it didn't. It did not predict who would do better. The people who were most insulin resistant did not do better on low carb than low fat. They did the same. And then it occurred to me at one point, the people that seemed to be having a hard time were the insulin resistant people on low fat getting added sugar and refined grain, because that was really stressing their metabolism. And we had told the low fatters not to do that. So I think what happened was, by focusing on a really good low fat and a really good low carb diet, we diminished this difference that other people had found. And so I can't say that insulin resistance thing works here. And boy, I think we tried it better than almost anybody had done. So we're super proud of this study, but I don't want to walk away from the fact that there still is, Kristen and Sarah, look at these graphs. There's an amazing amount of variability in both diets. Those are kilograms on the y-axis. So somebody's losing 30 kilos and somebody's gaining 10. That is a 40 kilo, 80 poundish range of response to the same advice. So yes, there is room for personalization here. I thought it might have been as easy as insulin resistance, and it wasn't. So that doesn't mean there's nothing going on here. It means the thing I was focused on doesn't work. But we really do need to focus on finding those issues of personalization that would help people pick the better diet for them.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll talk a bit about Zoe's research and the predicted studies soon, but that's really the thing we were trying to figure out is, what can explain this variability? What can we predict this variability based on many different pieces of information? So I just wanted to ask one thing about the previous slide, Christopher, because I know it's something that I was wondering. In terms of the dropout rate between the two groups, was there a big difference, or was that pretty similar?
Identical, actually. So we have another slide that's not in this presentation here. Absolutely identical. At the end of 12 months, it was the same number on both, which we think adds internal validity to the study, that they really got the message we were trying our best with both diets. It's not like they all dropped out more from one group than another because we were doing a crappy job with one and a good job with the other. Identical in both groups. So we felt really good about that.
Yeah, that is great. So our final myth is following a keto diet is better for blood sugar control. And often I've read about this, the statement being made that by cutting out carbs, you're really not putting your body under any pressure. you're not going to have any glucose responses. So what do you think about this myth, Christopher?
But I do think some people who have issues with blood sugar control are benefiting from keto because you're hardly eating any carbs. And so you're not making any insulin. And so I think the immediate effects are you're losing weight. On a keto diet, it's a very restrictive diet. So a lot of people lose weight fast on it because very few things are allowed, very few of the traditional things you've eaten. And so when that happens, when you're eating less, you're losing weight, there's no carbs. Yes, actually your blood sugar is going to clean up. But can people do it long term? I found a lot of people cannot do it long term. And blood glucose is not the only risk factor that's important. Clearly on a really low carb diet, you're not getting the plant foods that have the fiber. Zoe and I are really interested in the microbiome. And we all recognize that fiber is feeding the microbiome. So on a keto diet, it's quite low in fiber. And the microbiome is related to inflammation. So I'm currently involved in a study where we're trying to look not only at blood glucose in people with type 2 diabetes and prediabetes, but also inflammation, microbiome, immune function, and the other factors beyond blood glucose that could be affected by this.
Yeah, so I guess, Christopher, do you want to just quickly touch on this trial that you're running at the moment and what you hope to kind of gain from it? I know you've already touched on it, but it would be great to hear a bit about the study itself.
Sarah. So we don't have any results from this. We're in the middle of it. Sarah, if you can go to the next slide. This is the fun that we had. So how would we take all these concepts that we've been talking about just now and put them into this? And part of me loves the fact that even from ketogenic to vegan, there are things we agree on. We agree on lots of non-starchy vegetables, no added sugar, no refined grain. So both this Mediterranean diet that we're putting people on or a ketogenic diet have those three things in common. And then the things that are different is on the Mediterranean phase of the diet, you're supposed to get lots of legumes and beans, lots of fruits, and lots of whole intact grains. I will say you're not even supposed to have bread. You're supposed to have steel-cut oats and wheat berry salad. So not even any kind of floury grains. On keto, you can't have any legumes, any fruits other than a few berries that are allowed, and no grains at all, not refined, not whole grain, not even whole intact grain. So we're really trying to tease this apart. If the core of this benefit comes from getting rid of added sugars and refined grains, they both do that. After you get rid of added sugars and refined grains, is there an additional benefit to no legumes, no fruits, and no whole intact grains? I'm skeptical, but it's set up like this, and we actually have half the participants have type 2 diabetes and half of them have prediabetes. And so it might even be different for them. I actually think that people with type 2 diabetes are going to see really good impacts on their blood glucose and be more adherent. Because of that, the people with prediabetes don't have quite as much of a problem with their blood glucose. They might not be as adherent with the restrictive diet. So a couple slides back, part of the, one of the bullet points is satisfaction. So we're asking a lot of people how satisfied they are with the diets. And actually, after they've done both diets, we're checking in again with them 3 months later to see. Now it's a crossover. What are you eating now? You've tried both diets for 3 months. You've mastered them both. You've seen all your results. It's 3 months later. What are you eating now? I'm really curious what they're going to be eating later after they've done them both. So one more slide shows you sort of some of the outcomes. The main outcome is glycosylated hemoglobin. We've got some of the other standard ones, but I'm really interested in this new continuous glucose monitoring data we have that ZOE uses all the time, which is just fabulous, and immune response and inflammatory markers and microbiome, and at the end, adherence and satisfaction. So we're trying to build all those components into this ongoing study that'll finish up at the end of the year.
Great. Well,
as a non-researcher, what do you mean by dietary adherence?
So this is one of my frustrations in the field, Sarah, is we'll say there's a study of low carb and low fat. How low? And do people really follow it? And then sometimes the conclusion says diet A won over diet B. And you look a little closer and you find out they didn't really change their diet much. Or the way they defined low carb or low fat or keto wasn't the way you define it. And the headline just says keto or vegan or low fat. And so we spend a lot of time collecting dietary assessment data, analyzing it, trying to see if it was close, if they were adherent to what we were telling them to do. And what we often find is they weren't completely adherent. And this is important for two perspectives. One, if they're not adherent, then can't really say that diet that you were talking about worked or didn't work. So that's bad for the science and the messaging. But two, if you had it and you described it well and they didn't follow it, maybe it's not a realistic diet. Maybe that is important that they weren't adherent, because maybe real live people in the general population can't follow it. That's another important conclusion to build in to your interpretation of the study that's often missing in some of the papers that I read.
Yeah. Before we move on, Andres has asked, how do you measure immune response in the Keto Med study?
So we actually have been working with a number of different groups. So Mark Davis at Stanford got a huge Gates Foundation grant to start a human immune monitoring corps. And so his whole center at Stanford, we can turn over blood, urine, other kind of samples to him. One of the things we've been doing now, a company called Olink has developed a platform where we're measuring 300 different cytokines, 300 different inflammatory markers that are part of that cascade. And so we've been looking at IL-6 and IL-10, tumor necrosis factor, HSCRP, so a whole host of those inflammatory markers. And I will say, Sarah, for whoever asked that question, inflammation is really important and everybody's recognizing it. We haven't quite figured it out. It's not like measuring glucose or LDL and HDL cholesterol. There are dozens of these inflammatory markers that are related to immune function. I haven't quite narrowed it down to be able to say, your immune profile is, you ready for this? 42. Really? Is a number? No, there isn't a number yet. And so a lot of our studies are reporting multiple inflammatory markers and immune function markers that are going in different directions. So haven't figured that out yet, but the field is moving fast and I hope we make progress soon.
And do you think there will be some sort of sliding scale that everyone looks towards for information, or do you think it's too complicated?
No, I think we will. So Mark Davis's vision, and I'm sure others are after this as well, is that when you go to your clinician, you will get your blood pressure, glucose, a lipid panel, and your immune profile. So we're not there yet. For a while, it looked like maybe CRP, C-reactive protein would be this, but a lot of people are not happy with CRP. And so it needs to be more nuanced than just CRP. We're collecting so many fascinating things and conducting intervention studies and seeing things move up and down. I do think we'll get there.
That's fascinating. And I think we look forward to the conclusions of your Keto Med study. So I think I just wanted to speak to, I know Pam has made a comment in the question box, and she's kind of mentioned how, you know, in your low fat versus low carb study, maybe there was no difference in weight, but were there other differences such as feeling better? So she says she has insulin resistance and feels sick when she eats many carbs. And I just wanted to say, you know, this really speaks to that satisfaction factor and how food makes you feel. And so just to make sure everyone that's watching this is aware, you know, this webinar isn't about bashing low carb diets, but rather about trying to get you to think a bit about, you know, why would you cut out carbs? What are you replacing with? But then also to remind you that how food makes you feel is a really important part of this. And we're also we're not created equally. So, you know, the food we eat is complicated, and so are we. There's huge room for personalization when it comes to nutrition, and our individual biology really matters. So Christopher's already talked a bit about, you know, how nutrition research is complicated. But as someone who's been in this kind of field of research for quite a long time, Christopher, you know, could you speak a bit about dietary patterns and just a bit about, you know, carbs aren't just potatoes and bread, but, you know, they're found in many different foods in the context of a whole diet?
Yeah. So what I'm really after, Kristen, is people looking at sort of this foundational diet that has a lot of veggies, a lot of whole foods, minimal processed foods, minimal added sugar and refined grain. For most people, that means cutting back a lot of calories from added sugars and refined grain. And then biohack until ZOE has the better prediction models, and we are working on them, I think some people do better on more legumes and whole intact grains, and some people don't. Some people do better on more nuts and seeds and avocados and fatty fish, and maybe some lean proteins. And so for patterns, right? So we have keto and vegan. Mediterranean seems to be the most intriguing to me because there's a lot of wiggle room there. And Mediterranean is always associated with great taste. But I don't think there's one Mediterranean diet. Mediterranean is actually a low fat, a low carb, high fat diet. If you're having nuts and seeds and avocados and olive oil, your carbs aren't going to be 45 or 65% of your calories. They're going to be more like 40 or 35. And so it can be a high fat diet that's 40 or 45% fat. That's higher than most people eat. So for patterns, biohack and try some different things for replacing those refined grains and added sugars. And for a lot of people, it's going to be more fatty foods, I think, but they can still be healthy fatty foods.
Yeah. I think one important thing to mention is, once again, speaking about media headlines, carbs are poison, or, you get these really extreme headlines. No one nutrient or food is going to make or break. Dose, source, duration, and your individual biology really matters when it comes to food. And so, yeah, that's where this whole kind of dietary pattern comes into play. So if we could just go to the next slide. We're going to talk a bit about PREDICT. And I think, one thing to mention is nutrition research, it conventionally reports on the average. So, for example, this diet results in an average weight loss of this many pounds. But, reporting on the average can easily mask some of the important variation within groups. And so the waterfall plot that we saw earlier from the DietFit study really displays that variation within groups. So the PREDICT program is a collection of studies. PREDICT 1 was conducted in over 1,000 people in the UK, many of which were twins, so identical and non-identical twins. And then PREDICT 2 was a study that we did in the US, and it was completely home-based, so people could do the study from the comfort of their own homes. And, three of the key questions that we set out to answer were, how much variability exists between people? What is it that explains these differences? And, can we actually predict individual responses using machine learning? So we collaborated with, top nutritional scientists from around the world, like Christopher. We're using the latest tech, and we're combining this with big data to really understand, as you can see in the diagram on the screen, how all of these different interrelated factors affect our responses to foods. And if we go to the next slide, what we found was that, after these standardized test meals that our participants consumed, we saw a huge amount of variation in how their blood fat, their glucose, and their insulin responses, what they were. So it really goes to show that our responses to even the exact same foods varies wildly. So Christopher, I guess I'd be interested to hear what did you think when you saw these results from the PREDICT 1 study?
Yep, this is completely in line with the way I'm thinking. We always report averages, and almost no one is average. Just a couple of people are average. Almost everybody's above or below average. And so this is what's fascinating about what ZOE and PREDICT are doing, is they're teasing these things apart. And it isn't just one explanation, it's multiple components, as your previous slide showed. And so it's really taking big data and large numbers to show that. That's what PREDICT and ZOE are working on. So I'm really happy to be associated with it.
Yeah, so I can see there's a question in the question box asking, could mapping people's genome become important for dietary requirements? So there are a lot of companies out there that claim to be able to do this. And I think, from our research from the PREDICT study, which was published in Nature Medicine recently, we found that very little. So a person's glucose response, nutritional response, was explained very little by genetics. And Christopher, I know that your DietFit study found something very similar. So what do you think? Do you think we could give personalized diet advice based on genes or not, and why might that be problematic?
Yep. The whole genome thing is too complicated. I mean, people have been trying to look at weight and obesity and the genome for a decade now, and putting all the SNPs, the single nucleotide polymorphisms together, they're only explaining a few percent of the difference. So the slide before this was great. It's sleep, it's what you ate before and after, it's exercise. Those have much more of an impact on your than your genome, which is encouraging, because if it's your genome, that might sound better, that you know what you should be on, but it could sound bad because you'd be cursed. You can't change your genome, but you can change your sleep and your exercise and what you had before and after, and whether you pick steel-cut oats or cheesy veggie omelet for breakfast. So it is, I think the genome is a small amount. I don't think that's going to change, and I'm encouraged by it.
And
yeah, I think, oh, sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to say, and you know, some of the, I guess, predict2 users who have trialed the ZOE program, which we'll talk about at the end of the presentation, what we're also seeing is that, you know, thinking about how someone pairs their foods throughout the day is really interesting. So food combinations, food sequencing. So if you eat something really high fat in the morning, you should have less high fat things in the afternoon if you're bad at metabolizing fats. But you know, we can only figure out if you're, you know, how people metabolize fats and carbohydrates through understanding your biology.
For sure. I think what's quite liberating about the fact that genes, you know, explain so little about our nutritional responses is that we're really not a prisoner to our makeup, and there's things we can do. And as Sarah, you know, mentioned, what's key there is understanding our unique biology. So Christopher, I guess, you know, we're going to talk a bit about the importance of personalization, but, you know, how should we be eating? Is there a foundation that most of us could try and follow to be healthier and to eat better?
Yeah, I'm going to say, I'm going to guess ahead of time, when all the personalization is done, there isn't going to be anybody who should be on the jelly bean diet or the donut diet or the butter diet. I really think everybody should be eating more vegetables and more whole foods. Everybody should be eating less added sugar and refined grain. And I think that's going to be 50% of the issues that people have that they should clean up in their diet, if you haven't done that already. After that, then there's a wealth of taste and personalization option that's still left open to you. So I'm trying to work on making that foundational diet clear. Everybody should eat a basically good, healthy diet, and then build on that with personalization.
Yeah, and I guess so we really believe that the future of nutrition is personalized, and so the research we've been doing for the past 3 years is underpinning what's coming next. So if we could go to the next slide.
Sure.
So Sarah, do you want to chat a bit about Zoe's product?
Sure. So, you know, for those of you who are on our waiting list for the ZOE program, essentially what we're going to be launching in the next month is what I'm going to steal some words from what Christopher said in the presentation, which is like biohacking for beginners. So, you know, it's really using the first week of the ZOE program to understand how you metabolize fats and carbohydrates. And we do that through things like blood tests, finger prick tests, having a continuous glucose monitor in your arm for a week. And then we also collect your poop and look at your microbiome to see what microbes you have inside. And then we'll give you an insights report, and we'll tell you how you metabolize fats and carbohydrates, what foods you should combine together, when you should eat some of your meals. And as we progress and as more people use the program, we can compare that data to one another, and then make the big data sort of analysis that we have smarter and smarter, so that we can look into things like sleep and exercise and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I think one really important thing to mention about what Zoe's doing is, you know, we're constantly trying to understand all of this more deeply than anyone else, I think, out there. And yeah, the answer is, you know, we're constantly learning new things from this data that we've collected through our studies. And so if you don't follow us already, we're on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And for those who have signed up to the webinar, we hope that you've signed up to our mailing list, because we share some really interesting articles on our website throughout the week. Yeah, I guess that's it for today. And Christopher, we've really had a great time chatting to you today. So thank you for all of your amazing insights and expertise. Sarah, should we go through some of these questions?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start off by answering Naomi's question. So the test kit will be available in the US first in August. And so August will be beta testing, and then September it will launch for anybody to purchase in the US, and then in the UK it will go live early in 2021. So I'll move on to a question from Joe, which I hope we've understood this right. It says, what about food on arthritis? So I imagine, Joe, you're asking about how might the foods we eat impact arthritis? Christopher, I don't know if that's something that you feel comfortable responding to, or
if Kirsten has an answer, that would be great. I don't, because I don't study that specifically. I think it falls under the general category of antioxidants, right, to lower inflammation. And there's so many antioxidants, and they're never in beef or chicken or fish or dairy. They're always in legumes and fruits and vegetables. And those can be prepared in incredibly tasty ways. And so I would just say it's more plant-based phytochemicals for the antioxidants that you get from them. I'm not a big proponent of supplements. You could get some of those things in supplements as well, but those doses and sources aren't approved yet. And so to hedge your bet, I would just say a lot of plants in your diet full of antioxidants. You can look for different lists on Google of the ones that have the most antioxidants. None of those are perfect, but that'd be a starting point. I wish I had better info for you.
Yeah, I think the best thing to mention there is, I'm also not an expert in this field, but there are registered dietitians and registered nutritionists out there who specialize in these areas. So it's worth seeing if you can get a referral to one of those people who actually specialize in the area.
We've got another question from Nida, who is asking, what's your experience or views on very low calorie diets, such as the direct study for diabetes remission and weight loss versus low carb diets?
Yes. So, I mean, weight loss tends to clear up a lot of things metabolically. And we have an obesity epidemic, and nobody seems able to resolve it. The issue, a really nice 2013 paper that kind of went through all the different kinds of diets, said, somebody always benefits from one of the diets. There isn't one diet that works for everybody. The ones that work tend to be caloric restriction diets. And a funny take home that I got from this, that not many people that I know have seemed to latch onto this, is a tiny little paragraph that I love in this write-up that says across the different studies that some that have calorie restriction and some that don't actually have a prescribed calorie restriction, but they have an achieved calorie restriction. So give me just 30 seconds on that. To me, that's a satiety thing. So in Diet Fits, we actually didn't tell people to restrict calories. We told them to restrict fat sources and carb sources. And they lost 6,500 pounds collectively without a prescribed energy restriction. And what we focused on from the beginning was, we said, we really want you to eat healthy foods and to feel full and satiated, because if you aren't, then eventually you'll feel like the study's over and you can go back. We want you to feel satiated enough that you could eat this way forever. You're not on a diet that you'll go off. You have a new eating pattern. And so that's what I would say for this, for calorie restriction. Don't think of it calorie restriction. That sounds punitive, and that sounds like you'll be hungry. See if you can biohack some of these foods that you find more filling. Sometimes Barbara Rolls has an idea called volumetrics, where it's the volume of the food that you're looking at. Oh my God, I'm going to be totally stuffed when I eat this. But it was an enormous salad, and it had some fat, had some olive oil and some nuts and seeds and things like that on it. But this enormous salad filled you up and you aren't hungry, and you ended up eating fewer calories. So I'm into lowering your calories, but with satiety, not energy restriction, which sounds so punitive, if that makes sense.
So one final question from Pam. She's asking if there's research on chemicals in meat fats versus organic meats, and whether or not those chemicals in the fat of the meat cause problems. It's a very specific question.
Well, no, it's actually a really broad question. Are we talking about antibiotics? Are we talking about hormones? Are we talking about they're eating, the meat sources are eating so many different things. And I can tell you that there aren't, and there won't ever be a study like that, unless you wanted to see, you know, just as a parallel, if you wanted to see if spraying pesticides on plants was bad for you, you could see if the pesticides ended up in your blood, but nobody's checked to see if those people live or die, because they look at kids and they're not going to wait 90 years till the kids die. So kind of similar with meats. Yes, there's different chemicals in meat. You could check people and blood levels, but you never know what blood levels are actually harmful unless you wait to see what health consequences arise. And you typically have to wait so long that you can't control how much of the high chemical meat they're eating from the lower chemical meat. So we don't have any good answers on that. And that's why some people are hedging their bets and they're trying to eat pasture-raised, grass-fed, organic, antibiotic-free. We aren't going to be able to prove that anytime soon. Sorry.
What about intermittent fasting? Is this something that you studied, Chris?
Now, I do have a postdoc who published one of the few papers on this. And so there isn't an answer. And one of the reasons there's too many ways to intermittent fast. So for the questioner who said that, this could be 5 days of the month. That's one of the types. This could be 2 days of the week. This could be every other day. This could be the type where it's a window of every single day. So if you all finish dinner at 6 p.m. and you don't eat again until 6 the next morning, that's a 12-hour fast. Some people are skipping breakfast and eating everything between noon and 6 p.m. That's a much longer window. And the problem there is adherence and documenting adherence. So you can ask people to eat that way, but it's hard to see if they're snacking sometimes because they're hungry. So one, there's an adherence issue. And so we don't have good studies on it for that reason. And the other, Sarah, is there's too many different things that fall under this umbrella of intermittent fasting. I mean, if you look historically at certain religious groups that fasted for periods of time, that didn't impair their health. But I actually think there's a spiritual and religious side of that beyond a health side that's not to be dismissed. I think that's a part of a healthy, holistic life too, if that's something that's important to you. So sorry, that was a tough question.
I think something else that's important to mention with its intermittent fasting is also, you know, is it something that works for you? We're all different, you know, what we like to eat, when we share meals with our friends and family, you know, all of those things also come into play. So that's also just something to remember. We're all so different.
And I'd hate to see you eating poorly in the window that you get to eat. So yes, you'd be restricting calories, but you should still eat a healthy diet. Kristen, one of the things I think some people benefit from is instead of remembering all the rules about carbs and fats and vitamins and minerals, they look at their watch and say, what time is it? Oh, I don't eat now. That's just such a simple rule. Oh, I eat now. I think for some people, if nutrition is confusing, the intermittent fasting gives them a little more control because it's such a simple rule. I eat or I don't right now.
Exactly.
Right, I think those are all the questions that we've got time for today. Christopher, thank you so much for taking the time. Enjoy the rest of your day in California. I think it's still the early morning there. Kirsten, thank you as well for your for sharing some of your experience and some information on Predict. So like we said, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. We post the latest scientific research, interviews with some of the most amazing scientists in the world, like Christopher. And if you've got any thoughts on future webinars that you'd love to see from us, please send us a tweet or send a message on Facebook. We'd love to hear it. So thanks so much, everyone.
Sarah and Kirsten, that was fun. Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for joining us. Bye.
Bye, guys.